The Sonic the Hedgehog series for the most part has kind of been I don't know, like in terms of popularity, it's been up and down for the past like 3 decades or whatever. And it was hot in the 90s. It was um it was somewhat popular in the early 2000s. In the late 2000s, it was not popular, and throughout most of the teens, it was unpopular up until I think Sonic Mania, which kind of put Sonic back in the limelight. Don't get me wrong, Sonic Colors from 2010 was also a really good game. It was probably one of the better 3D Sonic games post Sonic Adventure 2 from 2001. But for the most part, there's been more misses than hits with the Sonic the Hedgehog series. But the thing is, I do feel that the Sonic Advance series from like the early 2000s is one that's highly underrated. And it's really shocking that, Sega has not remade any of the three games that came out between, I believe, '01 and '03, '04. And the reason why I say that these three games deserve a remake is because they were highly underrated. And I feel like it was um, it was one of those things that kind of kept the series alive and somewhat salvaged it following Sonic Adventure 2, because I feel like after that a lot of people kind of tuned out. And Sonic Heroes from 2004 was actually solid, but then I think after '04 it really, like, the series really started to go downhill slowly, because everyone knows that the Sonic the Hedgehog game for 2006 was just, I mean, that was the game you know, that arguably like almost killed the series altogether, because it was so bad. The reviews was so negative. The story was so convoluted, and it got to a point where a lot of people had lost interest after that. And with Sonic games, you had like a lot of gimmick games, like the one where he was a werewolf, or Sonic and the Secret of the Rings, which was not bad, by the way, but it wasn't as good as older games. But it seems like for the most part, after like the early 2000s, it seems like Sonic games for the most part kind of just became less and less popular. But it seems like recently, with the past couple of games like Sonic Frontiers and Sonic Mania, that the Sonic the Hedgehog series is more popular now than it's ever been. And I do feel like Sonic Advance, like from the 2000s, were among um, like the 3 games that came out were among the best Sonic games of that decade, and they were all exclusively on the Game Boy Advance. And I do feel all 3 of these games were overshadowed because there was a lot of, like, popular video games in the Game Boy Advance, mainly the Pokemon series, which sold millions, to a point where anything Nintendo had, like, put out for Mario got overshadowed by Pokemon. And I do feel that, the Sonic Advance series was kind of a victim of that as well. And the thing about the Sonic Advance series as to why Sega has not remade it yet, um, I think for the most part, it's because you look at Sonic Advance 1, 2, and 3, I think they were co-developed by Dimps and the Sonic team. And then you look at the publishers are Sega and THQ. So I believe Sega was the publisher for the Sonic Advance series in Japan, and THQ is the publisher in America. So I think that may have been the reason why, because THQ had a part in the game being released in America. And I think because of that, and because of the fact that Sega is no longer doing business with THQ, um, Sega has not, remade the Sonic Advance series. Also, because, like, for the most part, I don't think there's been like a high demand for that to be a thing, because, like, to me, the Sonic Advance series was kind of like Nintendo's version of 2D Sonic games, which made it pretty unique, and it kind of worked. It felt like the older Sonic games from the early '90s Sega Genesis era. But the thing is, the Sonic Advance series was exclusively for like the Game Boy Advance, and I don't think they bothered doing a doing a sequel to Sonic Advance 3 because they had moved Nintendo had moved on to their next generation game system, which was Nintendo DS, and Nintendo DS was kind of like a portable like N64. So I don't think 2D gameplay on Nintendo DS would have been as good as what we got on the Game Boy Advance. And and I do feel that Sega probably at some point wanted to do something with Sonic Advance and wanted to like remake it or what have you. But at this point, like I feel like they've just moved forward and they're not really into remaking, classic games from the 16-bit era or the Game Boy Advance era. I definitely feel like Sonic Advance 1, 2, and 3 deserve, 2D remakes, but it's very unlikely to happen. Otherwise, it would have happened by now. Also, another thing about the Sonic Advance series was that it was more difficult than the older Sonic games, especially Sonic Advance 2. That game was arguably more difficult than Sonic Advance 1 and 3. And if Sega planned on remaking that, they would have to like tone down difficulty to make it appealing to casuals. And I would say the same thing for all three games. I mean, the difficulty level for those three games would have to be toned down. And I get the fact that they're all Nintendo games, but this is in the '80s, and there's like platform games have no business being that difficult. But yeah, all three of those games were actually fun back in the day, and it's hard to believe that it's been at least 20 years since all three of those games was released. And obviously, the Sonic team hasn't been really doing business with dimps as much as they were back in the day, and I do feel that even though we're getting more like 2D like Sonic games in this day and age, I do feel like Sega, want to focus more on 3D Sonic games as well, and they want to look more towards the future opposed to the past and remaking old games and bringing back, old characters that are kind of forgotten about. Um, I do feel that I do feel that Sonic Advance series is something that a lot of people will never forget about, and I do feel it's one of those things that's better probably left off in the past than Sega trying to remake it or what have you, because technically I'm not sure if they can do that. I know that Sega owns the IP for Sonic and all that, but yeah, I don't think there's any real interest in bringing back the Sonic Advance series. A lot of people would be thrilled if that did happen, but it's been 20 years and Sega's done nothing with it, so I wouldn't necessarily get my hopes up on a remake for Sonic Advance 1, 2, and 3 anytime in the near future.